Chapter 11 Psychodynamically Oriented Psychotherapy. The Quality Assurance Project asserts that individual psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy is the treatment of choice for avoidant personality disorder. This is in contradistinction to most contemporary writings that advocate cognitive behavioral therapy over all other forms of treatment for avoidant personality disorder, AvPD. The basic technique. In contrast to cognitive therapy, which emphasizes correcting, psychodynamically oriented psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy emphasizes understanding. Psychodynamically oriented psychotherapy recognizes that the inner life of avoidants determines a good deal of their outer behavior. Its goal is to help avoidants understand the inner workings of their current removal behaviors through and through so that they can replace withdrawal with new, more comfortable, adaptive, satisfying, and mature interpersonal contexts, free of irrational, unconscious fear. As Miller notes, its method consists of reconstructing unconscious anxieties at the roots of the avoidance and exploring the avoidance anxiety-provoking fantasies as they occur in the patient's present life, as well as in his or her transference to the therapist. Inculcating insight. Psychodynamically oriented psychotherapies emphasizing the central role insight plays in attaining a cure focus on strengthening old and inculcating new self-awareness. Many avoidants do not discern that they are avoidant or the extent to which they suffer from AvPD. A case example. An avoidant patient, though aware that he suffered from AvPD, was unaware of the extent to which he was inhibited and of how his inhibitions affected his life, compromising his own functionality and troubling those around him. In the realm of how his avoidance affected his life, he said he was pleased with the way his life was going, even though his fears kept him from leading a full, connected existence and instead forced him into the shadows of dark, anxiety-laden remoteness. But he failed to recognize how masochistically he was acting when he attempted to relate only in circumstances where he was assured that no relationship would develop, and how destructively he acted when he used the internet not to meet someone, but to act out his avoidances. Not advancing his case, but presenting his case history, putting himself in a negative light by offering bad presentations of his good qualities. As when he painted his preference for fidelity as clinging and his flexibility as desperation. Ambivalence of the caring, sharing, no one over 25 sort appeared in his internet ads as his way not to expand horizons, but to eliminate good possibilities. Rigid preferences in the making of non-negotiable demands led him to insist that for him it was crucial that others have identical interests, something he called compatibility, though for him it was a reason not for inclusion but for exclusion. Particularly unwelcoming in his ads was his overemphasis on preferred age and body habitus that amounted not to suggestions about what he would like in someone, but to criticisms of what he disliked about everyone. Not surprisingly, few responded to his ads, and those who did made a date, then broke it, or kept the first date just so that they could break the second, sadistically building up his expectations now, the better to disappoint him later. In the realm of how his avoidance affected the lives of others, he suspected that his perfectionism troubled and hurt other people who otherwise might love him. He knew when it comes to relationships, I hurt my chances too by being so demanding. But he failed to recognize how much he had become, to use his last girlfriend's words, a perfect snob who hurt others as he dropped someone already good enough just to look for someone even better. Other avoidants, though they discern that they are avoidant, deliberately, if unconsciously, downplay and cover up the extent of their avoidance and the degree to which it limits them socially. They paint this distorted picture of themselves to the therapist because they are terrified that the therapist, the very person from whom they seek help, will criticize them like everyone else, ridiculing and humiliating them by dismissing their problems, calling them lazy losers, wallflowers, and wimps, condemning them as bad instead of treating them as troubled, and rather than helping them get better, punishing them for being ill. So they censor crucial intimacies out of embarrassment and shame, or they reveal them but simultaneously excuse them as not me, closing off an in-depth discussion of their psychological problems by blaming their circumstances or other people, as when they present their inability to connect not as an emotional problem of theirs, but as a natural, expected, anyone would feel that way response to externals beyond their control. So we hear you can't meet anyone in this hick town or in a big city like New York, or none of the bars in this dump are any good, or my boyfriend is the problem, or my boss makes me work so hard that I am always too tired to socialize after work, or everywhere I go villains harass me sexually, or my parents defeat me at every turn, or my wife's only goal in life is so to torture me. Often citing contemporary do-your-own-thing or me-ism philosophies, they blame the society in which they live for being a place where everybody encourages them to be avoidant. Frequently, they blame not their psychology, but their biology, and we hear, it's inherited. I was born this way. It's not me, it's my chemical imbalance. I'm ugly, I have physical problems. I'm too old, or my genes hold the real secret of my inability to connect. They also rationalize their avoidance as healthy, typically disguising it as a preference to taste. As an example, one avoidant who nightly dreamed that he wanted to, but was afraid to meet people, daily rationalized his avoidance as follows. I prefer to live alone because I can fill the refrigerator with what I want to eat, drop my clothes wherever I want to, play my sound equipment when and how loudly it suits me, and when I go to work and leave a can of soda cooling behind, know it will be there, just waiting for me when I return. Reducing guilt. Psychodynamically oriented psychotherapists focus on understanding and reducing guilt that creates withdrawal due to rigidly prohibitive, critical, unaccepting, and self-destructive attitudes, especially those relating to success and survival. Thus, an avoidant believed that she should not marry until both a favorite aunt and all her sisters found themselves a husband. Unconsciously, she saw the world as a zero-sum place where getting something for herself necessarily meant hurting others by outshining them, and where getting anything at all meant taking an equivalent something away from someone else. Exploring the choice of ego ideals. Psychodynamically oriented psychotherapists also focus on discovering if avoidance relational ideals or ego ideals are chosen not by, but for them. That is, if they originate in free will or are determined by unconscious forces. In my experience, few people are avoidant, and hence alone by choice. Even those avoidants who swear that they are truly happy in their loneliness and isolation, who insist that their isolation is splendid, and who affirm the wonders of being able to come and go as they please, without that proverbial ball and chain around their ankle, really desire closeness and healthy dependency, not the complete freedom that they say they want. Instead, their desire to be free is, in fact, a compunction to remain unattached, and that is, in turn, largely the product of a rigid, self-punitive morality that leads them to be so preoccupied with matters of good and evil, that they find themselves forced to squelch their human feelings in order to angle for sainthood and martyrdom, their way to deal with the shame they feel about their anger, and to reduce the self-humiliation they put themselves through for having even the most modest of sexual desires. Dealing with unhealthy defenses. Psychodynamically oriented psychotherapists focus on identifying unhealthy defenses so that they can help avoidants first to relinquish them, and second, to put healthier defenses in their place. Healthier defenses include counterphobic defenses to master anxiety by facing and meeting it head-on. Damn the torpedoes, and resignation defenses, where avoidants learn to tolerate a small amount of anxiety and relax onto their fears instead of resolutely meeting them head-on, only to find that they have made things worse for themselves by trying to fight what is predictably going to be a losing battle. Dealing with secondary gain. Psychodynamically oriented psychotherapists routinely ask avoidants to relinquish the secondary gain they harvest from avoidant symptoms once formed. As I ask agoraphobic avoidants to relinquish the pleasure they get from always having a companion on street outings, and social phobics to relinquish the gratification they get from lazily avoiding giving a speech. I asked mingles avoidants to relinquish the gratification they obtain from sex, good, and plenty, and instead seek greater gratification from closeness and commitment, quality over quantity. Dealing with transference resistances. Psychodynamically oriented psychotherapists are ever alert to the avoidant negative transference resistances that, by highlighting their patients' problems in microcosm, serve as useful grease for the analytic mill. Avoidants often resist therapy by avoiding the therapist, the same way they avoid everyone else. They fail to show up for an appointment, call to make another one, and break that. Come late, calling to say I'm just leaving from home about the time their appointment starts, or coming at the right time but on the wrong day. All the while apologizing yet continuing to repeat their actions. Too often, they respond to eureka insight by becoming critical of the therapist who imparted it. Thus, one patient, each time she learned something meaningful, responded by devaluing the teacher, me, to render the teachings less troubling by damning them, and me into insignificance. Another patient responded to interpretations that made her anxious by reviling me as a know-nothing, damned if you do, and damned if you don't, doctor. Feeling I pushed her too far, too fast, she complained, "You are making me anxious." Yet, feeling I was too accepting of her reluctance to try to meet people, she complained, "You aren't doing your job." She then attempted to reduce her anxiety by intensifying mine, by criticizing me personally, first for being lax and then for being incompetent and unethical. Thus, on the days she thought that I was married, she accused me of having extramarital affairs and trying to seduce her, while on the days she thought I was single, she accused me of being a priestly celibate or a homosexual disinterested in her because I was disinterested in all women. Supplemental techniques. Psychodynamically oriented psychotherapy is rarely fully effective unless accompanied by supplementary methods employed to put the understanding obtained to use. Exposure techniques do more than just habituate the individual to anxiety directly. They also simultaneously facilitate the psychoanalytic process by releasing anxious thoughts that can then be brought back into therapy for discussion. Pharmacotherapy can help subdue fear and reduce guilt, and meditation and deep breathing exercises can help the avoidant relax, putting him or her into a better frame of mind to work on understanding what went wrong in preparation for doing something to make it right. A case example. A patient, an avoidant in both his professional and his personal lives, entered therapy complaining that he was too shy to meet old and make new friends, and suddenly to meet someone to become his partner. At work, he volunteered for night duty so that he would not have to interact with too many co-workers or spend too much time with his family. In his personal life, he had one love affair when he was very young and never had another. Many years ago, when he was a teenager, he fell in love with the girl next door, but he was too shy to speak to her directly. The best he could do to make contact was to tie a romantic message for her on an arrowhead and shoot the arrow over the fence and into her yard. He thought that that was just the right flourish. Instead, he was surprised and chagrined to discover that the next phone call wasn't from her, but from the police. As an adult, he kept one or two old friends to satisfy his minimal attachment needs. And on those rare occasions when he agreed to go to parties, once there, he stood in the shadows in the corner of the room, looking longingly at, but unable to join in with, the people having fun. He scared off what few people he managed to approach, or who approached him, by putting them in no-win situations, rejecting them, both if they reacted friendly because he feared people who got too close, and if they acted unfriendly because he disliked people who kept their distance. Then he would leave for home early, and all by himself to return to his small apartment, where he could watch television with the phone pulled and the intercom turned off using a special switch he installed. accepting only email because that way, instead of being the passive victim of anyone who decides to call and bother me, I can pick up my messages when and only when I choose. On occasion, later in life, he was able to start a serious romance, only to pull back early in the game, after telling himself that it would not work out. First, he brooded about all the mistakes he might make that, as he was convinced, would turn the other person off. Then he would perversely actually make those mistakes so that he could ensure that his gloomy predictions would come true because nothing could ever work out for him. Then he would think, I already ruined things, so why bother continuing? And in anticipation of complete disaster, he would become protectively remote and distant and bolt before a potential partner could, as he soon became convinced would happen, lose interest in him. In reality, other people did not much take to him. His appearance made it difficult for him to connect with the very few people he felt comfortable knowing. As he said, they call me Skull because of my sunken eyes and cheekbones, weird because my face is asymmetrical, and peculiar because as I walk, I keep one shoulder higher than the other. However, instead of doing what he could to improve his appearance, he confined himself to checking in the mirror from time to time, assessing flaws, overlooking virtues, and not really thinking about making those repairs that were both indicated impossible. Unconsciously, he held himself back because he actually wanted to look strange to others, so that others would continue to remain complete strangers to him. Over the years, he developed a number of social phobias relating to different specific trivial prompts symbolizing a variety of deep interpersonal terrors. In part, he had installed these phobias so that he could avoid getting close to people, his way to live out his motto, if you fear visiting them, you won't go, and if you don't go, you won't have to invite them back. He could drive over bridges when he was not going to a date's house, but when he was, he could not make it across due to the fear that he would faint, lose control of his car, hit an abutment, and have a fatal accident. Additionally, he was unable to take the train because he feared it would crash. He also developed a phobia of being in church. During the service, he had to sit near the exit door so that in case he should feel weak and faint, he could get out without calling attention to himself. Eventually, he began to have some difficulty venturing out of doors at all. During the day, he had trouble going out because he feared being stung by flying insects, particularly wasps, and because he feared a repetition of an incident where a policeman had stopped him for no reason at all and asked him, in what he thought was an accusatory fashion, where he was going. Next, he completely stopped traveling from his hometown to the city for all the reasons just mentioned, and because he had become convinced that the second he got off the train, someone would approach him, pick his pocket, and strand him by taking the money he needed for the return trip. In spite of these limitations and the considerable suffering attendant upon them, he claimed that being an avoidant had many advantages. As he, in essence, put it, "It's great keeping my positive emotions in check. That way, I can avoid humiliating myself by expressing feelings that I consider to be both so passionate as to be embarrassing and so common as to be trite. Besides, I do not really need other people. All I need comes from within. I enjoy my own company best. I like being isolated. and get a great deal of pleasure from being able to go home, sit there surrounded by the things I love, and come and go as I please. I enjoy collecting things so much that I feel that the worst day at the flea market is better than the best day at the meat market. And anyway, my cat is my best friend, someone I can always count on, unlike everybody else I have met up to now. Other therapeutic work consisted in part of understanding in depth how his avoidances began. For example, we learned that his fear of criticism partly originated in his early relationship with a mother who savaged him when he did things wrong, without also complimenting him when he did things right, to the point that, as he put it, with a sort of humorous resignation, she actually died before she could say even a single nice thing to or about me. We also uncovered, clarified, and analyzed the here and now fantasies that made up his current avoidant symptoms. We discovered that his shyness partly consisted of staying away from people out of concern that he would take anyone he met away from someone else, much as his siblings took his mother away from him. An intense moral scrupulosity also led him to fear that others might criticize him for his sexual feelings. He wanted to be a good role model for others he believed should, when it came to sexual relationships, follow his lead and be just as Spartan and abstemious as he was. As he described it, he was an advocacy for the highest level of morality, whose means of getting rid of temptation was not, as Oscar Wilde said, to yield to it, but, as he said, to get rid of the people who tempted him. We discovered that for him, stinging insects symbolized his critical mother, as did the preacher in church and the policeman on the street. We further learned that he could not take the train because the moving train symbolized his impulses, and train crushes the dreadful consequences of having and expressing them. Driving over the bridge symbolized his fears of forward movement and success, reaching the pinnacle only to be mauled physically, for example, castrated, as a consequence of soaring. We analyze his church phobia as due both to a fear of being submissive, controlled by the proceedings, and to a fear of being embarrassed publicly should he get too emotional about the service and lose control. The latter fear had some basis in reality, for on more than one occasion, just a small amount of alcohol released his inhibitions, to the point that he acted aggressively in public and said nasty things to people he hardly knew, mostly but not always under his breath. Such understandings gleaned over several years of therapy helped him deal with his relationship anxiety enough to form tentative, partially intimate relationships. He kept his old friends and developed a few new ones. He moved in with a woman he felt comfortable with, partly because she was an avoidant herself, an unassuming, undemanding person who desired little closeness and intimacy from him or from anyone else. They fought a great deal and threatened to leave each other on a regular basis, but that was only their way to reassure themselves and each other that neither was engulfing or being engulfed by the other. On follow-up, he said that now was the happiest time of his life, although he recognized, as my therapist, you are probably disappointed in me, thinking that the adjustment I made is somewhat less than ideal, at least according to what I consider to be your overly rigorous standards, particularly what I perceive, and you know that I am right, to be your belief that everyone should get married, and that anything less than marriage represents an unsatisfactory adjustment to life, because by definition it represents a lesser way to live.